Good day, everyone. Welcome to another screencast in Methods of Research. I am your professor for today, Dr. Supache Basit, and for today's session, we will be talking about research framework. So, let us define what do we mean by a framework. So, framework is actually defined as a set of ideas that provide support to something. So, which means essentially any concept or theory requires a strong framework to establish its general feasibility. Just like the skeletal system of our body, without the framework, our body wouldn't be able to stand independently, right? So, which means that here in research, without your framework, your research cannot stand on its own. So, therefore, framework is described as the abstract, logical structure of meaning that guide the development of the study. Meaning, without the framework, there's no way in which your study could actually develop. So all frameworks are based on identification of key concepts and most importantly, the relationship among those concepts that you have previously identified in your study. That is the reason why in this particular module, it's quite difficult to create or to answer the worksheet alongside this module without having a working research title because you will be basing your your concepts based on the problem that you have actually identified. So let's define concept. So when we say concept, concept is actually the abstractly would will actually describe, okay, or it is actually a name or object or a certain phenomenon, thus providing it with separate identity and meaning. So concept is an intellectual representation of some aspect of reality that is derived from observations made from phenomena. So, for example, you are doing research, health research, or a medical research, or research in medical laboratory science. In order for you, to let's say, for example, gather data, then you may want to do some experiment in the wet lab, and then by observing phenomenon of a particular concept, then you are able to gather your empirical data. So an example of a concept is level of anxiety or stress or pain. Or in cases of medical laboratory science, let's say for example antibiotic resistance. So that's an example of concept. Okay, so blood sugar level. So that is an example of a concept. So construct. So when we say construct, these are concepts at very high levels of abstraction that have general meaning. So a construct is actually associated with the concept of anxiety. So when we speak of anxiety, there are several constructs that may be associated with it. So let's say, for example, when we speak of blood sugar level, so there are many constructs that may be associated with blood sugar level. So variables. This signifies a more concrete level and are narrow in their definitions. So a variable, you have to remember, it has to be specific. And of course, in the parlance of research, your variable has to be measurable. So you cannot actually introduce a variable in your study that there's no way for you to measure. Let's say, for example, can you measure love? No, because the measure of true love is to love without measure. Something like that, di ba? So you cannot really include love as part of your variables. So framework can be derived from related concepts. So we call it conceptual framework, or it can also be developed from existing or can also be derived from existing theories. So that's the reason why we call it the theoretical framework. So the terms conceptual framework and the theoretical frameworks are sometimes used interchangeably, but they have different meanings. So usually, when you do your research proposal, you will be choosing what is more appropriate in your study. Will it be a conceptual framework or will it be theoretical framework? Just to help you decide please continue watching this video. Okay, so as what I told you, there are actually two types of research framework. Okay, so it could either be a theoretical framework and the other one is the conceptual framework. So let's discuss them one by one. So a theoretical framework serves as the basis of the research. So with conceptual framework. So however, in theoretical framework, it points out through its cited theories which specific variables will be the focus of the study. Meaning to say, if you have already developed your research problem, okay, so there could be a theoretical framework that is actually related to the to the main problem of your study. If you are able to identify one, then definitely you should be using theoretical framework, because by identifying a certain theory, you'll be able to focus, okay, with specific variables that are A. So the theoretical framework provides a point of focus for attacking the unknown in a specific area. Meaning, you'll be able to focus which variables to study, which I have already said in the previous slide. Okay, if a relationship is found between two or more variables, a theory should be formulated to explain why the relationship. This is something that you have to remember about theories. When we say theories, theories are purposely created and formulated. They are never discovered. They can be tested, but never proven. Then the only way you can test theory would be by presenting the supporting empirical evidence based on the observation of the phenomenon, okay, while you are doing that. So, according to Abdella, not someone, okay, Abdella defined theory as an explanation of a phenomenon or an abstract generalization that systematically explains the relationship among given phenomena for purposes of explaining, predicting, and controlling such phenomena. Wow. So this is quite also an abstract definition, okay? So let's say an explanation of a certain phenomenon. So that's theory. So perhaps one of the most controversial theories, the Big Bang theory. Okay, so that Big Bang theory is such controversial because it opposes the scripture, and at the same time, there are several disputes, there are several debates over the validity of the Big Bang theory. But are you saying that we can prove that Big Bang theory is true or not? Then let's go back to the previous slide. Theories are purposely created, formulated, but they are not discovered. Then let's go back to the last statement. It says here, it can be tested. We can test Big Bang theory, but we can never prove Big Bang theory because it's a theory. Okay? So the theoretical framework consists of theories that seems to be interrelated. Okay. So theoretical framework, the explanation concerns the relationship between two or more variables or phenomena. So in theoretical framework, it is more formal and it is used for studies based on existing theories. So what I'm trying to say here is that do not really enforce yourself to come up with a theoretical framework if the nature of your study is not actually applicable to have a theoretical framework. You can say that you, as the researcher, as the main proponent of your study. Okay, so it is derived from specific concepts and propositions that are either induced or deduced. Okay, so I hope you're able to get the triangle and the inverted triangle theme when I said induced or deduced. Okay, so what's the importance of theory in research? The function of theory in research is to identify the starting point of the research problem. See, you have to have a research problem first. And establish the vision to which the problem is directed. So it determines and defines, again, I keep on saying this, focus and goal of the research problem. Because without your theoretical framework, you may have the tendency to examine any variables or any phenomena that may not be actually related to the problem of your study. So that's the reason why, with a theoretical framework on hand, you'll be able to create focus. That way, the direction of your research is actually would actually be focused on a certain phenomena or variables. So, what are the purposes of theoretical framework? So, one is to test theories. So, test but you cannot prove. Okay? To make research findings meaningful, and you'll be able to make generalization. To establish orderly connections between observations and facts, to predict and control situations, and to stimulate. Okay, so what are the elements of the theoretical framework? First of all, you should have a relevant theories that are related to your study. So these are the theories that are partially or fully relevant to the present study and are discussed to provide a basis for the variables being studied. So how would you be able to find what are the relevant theories, okay, that are actually essential or of paramount importance to your study? Well, of course, the answer is by reviewing related literature. Okay, so these are published materials that compare the study with existing knowledge on the research topic. So that's the only way you'll be able to find relevant terms. Okay, so review of related studies include either previous theses or dissertations, theses or dissertations on research topic carrying the same variables, so or any published studies that are related to the one that you're studying. So that way, you'll be able to come up with the research paradigm or the paradigm, as some may pronounce it. Okay. So this is a diagrammatic representation of the study, so that you'll be able to visualize this or summarize the whole study. It will give you the bird's eye view, okay, of your study. Okay, so in developing the theoretical framework, you have to examine your thesis title. Again, that's the reason why before embarking on answering the module alongside with this particular uh, activity or particular module, you should have an approved research title and research problem. Okay, examine your thesis title and research problem. Then you have to brainstorm about what is considered as the key variables in the research. So since it is an individual work, you have to brainstorm with yourself or with your research advisor or with the colleagues. Okay, then very important, immerse yourself in studying literature and studies, okay, that are actually related to the one that you're studying. And then you have to list the construct and variables. That way, you'll be able to filter what are the relevant theories that are essential to your study. Then, you can now review the key theories after you have filtered them out and discuss possible assumptions or propositions. So, in discussing relevant theories, the following parts are mentioned. Of course, who are the proponents or proponent of that particular theory, so the author. Then the title of their theory, theoretical statement or the principle, explanation of the theoretical statement, and the relationship of the theory to the present study. So if you have decided to do theoretical framework instead of the conceptual framework, these are the 5 things that are essential to be part of your title, theory, explanation, and the relationship of the chosen theory to your present study. How about conceptual framework? Okay, so again, during the introduction, I've told you that sometimes conceptual framework and theoretical framework may be used interchangeably, but then again, these are actually different. Okay, so when you say conceptual framework, conceptual framework, it is derived from a combination of theories or part of theories. So this framework guides the researcher in synthesizing the different theories used in formulating a new one. Therefore, they are somehow related because conceptual framework is actually derived from a combination of theories. We need to say you have chosen relevant theories or part of. So, what are the purposes of conceptual framework? So, conceptual framework are important because this will allow you to clarify concepts and propose relationships among the concepts in the study. Now, this one is quite interesting because later on, you will be presenting conceptual model. And by using certain diagram, you'll be able to propose relationship among the concepts that you have identified in your study so that you'll be able to provide context for interpreting study findings. Conceptual framework would also allow you to explain observations and to encourage theory development that is useful to practice. So, again, I've mentioned about the conceptual models. So, purposes of theories and conceptual models. So, their overall purpose is to make findings meaningful and generalizable. Okay? Theories and conceptual models will help you to stimulate research. And when you say stimulate, in the parlance of research, you'll be able to expand. Okay? The extension of knowledge by providing both direction and or well, impetus or high level energy. Okay. So let me move the slide. So a model is a symbolic representation that will help the researcher to express abstract concepts and relationships easily using minimal words. So that's the reason why a model can be represented schematically or mathematically. So when you say schematic model, so you have to convey concepts and propositions through the uses of boxes, arrows, and other symbols. So take note that the diagram, the arrows that you will be using here are not for decorative purposes. They have a meaning. So if you're using, for example, a straight line, okay, a unidirectional arrow, a broken line, so they actually have meaning. Okay, so mathematical or statistical model convey concepts and propositions through the use of letters, numbers, and mathematical symbols. So one good example of using a statistical model is when you have path analysis. So later on, I'll be showing you an example of path analysis. Okay, so a conceptual paradigm is a diagram that visually represents and interprets underlying theory, principles, and concepts of a research. So it is like a visual representation of variables that interrelate with one another as perceived by the researcher before an empirical investigation is done to prove its relationship. Meaning to say, during the proposal stage, you should have a conceptual paradigm presented. Okay? Because this is your own perspective of your research problem. So, the most common example of conceptual model or paradigm is the IPO method. Okay? So, we have the input, process, and output. So, for example, when you say input is the variable that causes the problem, phenomenon, or transformation. So, for example, the profile of entrepreneurs, age, sex, or seminars that they have attended, or the roles of entrepreneurs in specimen collection, performance, something like that. So, remember, when you say input, these are the variable that causes the problem, phenomenon, or transformation. Okay. Now, on the other hand, when you say process is the method by which the variables are collected and synthesized at the same time. So, usually, when you say process, you are undergoing process such as analysis of data through questionnaires, informal interviews, statistical, and scientific treatment. Okay. so that you'll be able to come up with the third part of that paradigm, which is the output. So when you say output, so the problem, phenomenon, or transformation, okay, but this time this is now the outcome of the variables that you have previously presented in the input. Okay, so if a while ago your input is profile of entrepreneurs, so the output here would be improved role of entrepreneurs, higher returns, better quality of services. So if we're going to say apply it in health science research, so what could be an example of an input? So an example of an input would be the variables that cause the problem. So let's say, for example, um, uh, my input would be the MECA gene of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. What would be the process? My process is to identify a method in order to, or to use a method to silence the gene, the MECA gene. And then what would be my output? My output would be the output would be the previously resistant MRSA becomes non-multi-drug resistant bacteria. So are you getting the IPO process? So yeah, there. Okay, so do not forget, this one is the simplest and the most common. But I'm not saying that we'll just be enclose ourselves with the IPO method when presenting your conceptual model. So here's another example of IPO. So input, qualified teachers, effective method, adequate facilities, adequate supervisory assistance. The process is science instructional program, and the output would be superior science knowledge and skills of. Okay, so there you have a superior science knowledge, which means that you have improved the science knowledge. So that is an example of an output. Okay, so in another example of conceptual framework, the IPO method, but as you can see here, it is now quite more complicated. I'll explain it to you. So here you have three variables. The demographic profile. So this may not be necessarily an IPO method, okay? So here you have three variables. You have the demographic profile, the level of self-esteem, which could be high, moderate, or low, and the parenting styles of the respondents, because they could be authoritative, democratic, or permissive. So the existing framework is the Adolescent Reproductive Health Wellness Program. So it says here that, so take note, so the proponent was actually using a unidirectional arrow. What does it mean? An arrow, a straight, not necessarily straight, but this one is not straight, but a unidirectional arrow means you are inferring a cause and effect relationship, meaning demographic profile may affect parental styles, and the demographic profile may affect self-esteem, the level of self-esteem, and the level of self-esteem may affect the parental styles. Then the demographic profile may affect adolescent reproductive health wellness program. The level of self-esteem may affect the reproductive health wellness program, as well as the parenting styles. So all of them may affect this particular framework. So you can see, no? So we are using arrow not for decorative purposes, but by just looking at this one picture, okay, you'll be able to identify or to have the glimpse or the perspective or the bird's eye view of the proponent in his research proposal. That's the reason why presenting a conceptual paradigm is of paramount importance also in your research proposal. And that you cannot do if you do not have an approved research title until now. Okay. Now, another example of conceptual model would be the interplay of the independent variable or presentations of independent variable and dependent variables. Okay, which of course can of course result into this one, manual for application in secondary school. This could be the confounding variable. So when you say confounding variable, these are not part of independent or dependent variables, but they inadvertently affect the outcome of your study. Okay. So we can also have a conceptual model this time presenting a bidirectional arrow. Why? What does it mean? Means you can actually, when you say you have the bidirectional arrow, the dependent and independent variables are interchangeable. Meaning, the content of teaching may affect the teaching construct, and at the same time, the teaching construct may also affect the content of teaching. So something like that. So, however, you cannot just place an arrow here without actually describing it, because when you do your research framework, it is very important that you present it first, the diagram, and then you write the description of this particular diagram through several paragraphs, and your text has to be properly cited. Meaning to say, before you can come up with this particular model, it is expected that you have already had gone through a lot of reading. You have already read several literature. You have already reviewed several literature before you would be able to come up with this. If you do not have any citations, then your conceptual or theoretical framework may not necessarily be valid. So this one is another example of a statistical model or mathematical model of the concept. Why do I say so? Because here it gives you a positive and a negative cause and effect relationship. Meaning to say, attitude to exercise is directly proportional, or there's a positive relationship between the attitude to exercise to the amount of exercise. So you can see here, food intake. Food intake is negative relationship, meaning to say the two variables are inversely proportional. Meaning the more food intake that you have taken, and then weight loss would be inapparent. So inversely proportional. But a more appropriate way of presenting a statistical model, which could also be, of course, acceptable, which is also, of course, acceptable in research proposal, would be this one. In any study, we call it the path analysis. In path analysis, you are not just giving whether the direction is positive or negative. You are also giving a correlation coefficient. Okay, correlation coefficient. When you say correlation coefficient, it's the extent of relationship between two variables, because in correlation coefficient, one is the perfect relationship, but there's no perfect relationship. Okay, and then between 0.8 to 0.9 is a strong relationship, 0.4 to 0.7 is a moderate relationship, and below 0.4 is a weak relationship. So you can see here, there is a there is a 0.7, but lampas 0.7, so it could be moderate. There is a positive moderate relationship between the public library and the school library because of the correlation coefficient of 0.7. But wait, there's more. Look at the 3 asterisks. What does it say? So it says that when you have 3 asterisks, the p-value is less than 0.0001. 0.001, which means that the relationship between public library and school library is highly significant, very significant. Now, let's take a look between what's the relationship between the school library and the literacy rate. It's just 0.2. So point two is a weak relationship. So there is a weak relationship between the school library and the literacy rate. And that weak relationship is not even statistically significant. But take a look here. What is the relationship between the public library and the literacy rate? Well, it says here there is a positive, okay, weak relationship between the public library and the literacy rate. Though the relationship is weak, it's still statistically significant because the p-value is less than 0.05. But if you will be looking at the public library and the GDP, it doesn't here what that's GDP, but it's an example of it is an example of a what you call this another variable. So there is a negative weak relationship between public library and GDP per, but that negative weak relationship is not even statistically significant. Okay, so be careful when you use arrow because when you say arrow, you are actually inferring to cause and effect relationship. That's the reason why the statistical analysis that was just utilized here is a regression, a standardized Marshall regression. Okay, but if you are using a straight line, you are just referring to a monotonic or linear relationship. If you are using a broken line, means that there's no direct relationship between these particular two variables. Okay, so that's the reason why these arrows are not just for decorative purposes. Okay, so there you have it. The conceptual and theoretical framework in a nutshell. So be sure that you have an approved title. So make sure that you have an approved title before you answer the activity in this module. That will be all for now. God bless everyone. Stay safe. Bye.